without belief in God. But that wasn't the question. The question was, can we be good without God? When we ask that question, we are posing, in a provocative way, the meta-ethical question of the objectivity of moral values. Are the values that we hold dear and guide our lives by mere social conventions, akin to driving on the left versus right-hand side of the road, or mere expressions of personal taste, like having a preference for vanilla as opposed to chocolate? Or are they valid independently of our apprehension of them? And if so, what is their foundation? As the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz has put it, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation. That is to say, their foundation in reality. If they are neither derived from God, nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral. In his book, The Courage to Become, Kurtz helpfully distinguishes three main views in answer to this question. Theism maintains that moral values are grounded in God. Humanism maintains that moral values are grounded in human beings. And nihilism maintains that moral values have no ground at all and are therefore ultimately illusory and non-binding. Now, whether God is necessary for morality depends on what we mean by morality. If by morality you mean simply a certain pattern of social behavior prevalent among human beings, then obviously that sort of behavior could go on even if it turned out that God does not exist. God isn't necessary in order for human beings to exhibit certain patterns of social behavior that we call acting morally. But if by morality you mean that certain things are really good or evil, that certain actions are unconditionally obligatory or impermissible, then many theists and non-theists alike agree that God is indeed necessary for morality. In the absence of God, morality turns out to be just a human illusion. The same patterns of social behavior might go on without God, but it would be a delusion to think that such behavior has any objective moral significance. Accordingly, I'm going to argue tonight that if God exists, then the objectivity of moral values and moral duties is secured. But in the absence of God, that is to say, if God does not exist, then morality is plausibly just a human convention. That is to say, morality is wholly subjective and non-binding. We might act in precisely the same ways that we do in fact act, but in the absence of God, such actions would no longer count as good or evil, since if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Thus, we cannot truly be good without God. On the other hand, if we do believe that moral values and duties are objective, that provides moral grounds for believing in God. Moreover, I shall raise the question, if morality is just a human illusion, then why should we act morally, especially when it conflicts with self-interest? Or are we in some way held accountable for our moral decisions and actions? I shall argue that theism provides a more coherent view of morality by providing a basis for moral accountability. Consider then the hypothesis that God exists, whereby God I mean a personal supreme being. First, if God exists, then objective moral values exist. When we talk about moral values, we're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. It's to say, for example, that Nazi anti-Semitism was morally evil, even though the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust thought that it was morally good. And it would still be evil, even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them, so that everyone thought the Holocaust was good. On the theistic view, objective moral values are rooted in God. God's own holy and perfectly good nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. God himself is what Plato called the good. He is the locus and source of moral value. He is by nature loving, generous, fair, faithful, kind, and so forth. Sometimes people ask, does God will something because it is good? Or is something good because God wills it? The question is a false dilemma. Traditional theism rejects both alternatives. The alternative, traditionally taken by theists, is that God wills something because he is good. That is to say, the good just is God himself. He is the paradigm of goodness. Therefore, the good is not independent of God. Rather, God is the good. So, if God exists, objective moral values exist. Second, if God exists, objective moral duties exist. Duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Now, you might think that the distinction between right and wrong is the same as the distinction between good and evil. But if you think about it, you can see that this isn't the case. Duty has to do with moral obligation, what I ought or ought not to do. Now, obviously, you're not morally obligated to do something just because it would be good for you to do it. For example, it would be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to become a doctor. After all, it would also be good for you to become a firefighter, or a homemaker, or a diplomat, but you can't do them all. So there's a difference between moral values and moral duties. To say that we have objective moral duties is, again, to say that we have certain moral obligations to fulfill regardless of whether we think that we do. On theism, our moral duties are constituted by God's commands. God's moral nature is expressed toward us in the form of divine commands, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, these commands are reflections of his moral nature. His commands to us are therefore not capricious, but are the expression of his character. Therefore, it makes no sense to ask, for example, if God were to command us to eat our children, would it be right to eat them? Because this proposition has an impossible antecedent clause and therefore no non-trivial truth value. It's like asking, if there were a square circle, would its area be the square of one of its sides? The question has no meaningful answer because it's logically incoherent. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments. And these, in turn, are reflections of his essential character. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the whole moral duty of man can be summed up in the two great commandments. First, you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, and with all your soul, and with all your heart, and with all your mind. And second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression. Finally, on the theistic hypothesis, God holds all persons morally accountable for their actions. Evil and wrong will be punished. Righteousness will be vindicated. Good ultimately triumphs over evil, and we shall finally see that we do live in a moral universe after all. Despite the inequities of this life, in the end the scales of God's justice will be balanced. And thus the choices that we make in this life are infused with an eternal significance. We can, with consistency, make moral choices which run contrary to our self-interest, and even undertake acts of extreme self-sacrifice, knowing that such decisions are not empty and ultimately meaningless gestures. Rather, our moral lives have a paramount significance. So, I think it's evident that theism provides a sound foundation for morality. Now, contrast this with the non-theistic hypothesis. First, if God does not exist, then what is the foundation for objective moral values? More particularly, what is the basis for the objective value of human beings? If God does not exist, then it's difficult to see any reason to think that human beings are special, or that their morality is objectively true. On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior, because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, exhibit similar behavior for the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself noted in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers. And mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation to speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias in favor of one's own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why on atheism is he wrong when he says there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur. Second, if God does not exist,